I'm Alex Fiori. I'm the fashion features director of Another Magazine and the men's critic of the Financial Times. And I have chosen 3 shows: the Autumn-Winter 1987 haute couture debut of Christian Lacroix, the Autumn-Winter 1994 collection by John Galliano, staged in São Schlumberger's disused mansion in Paris, and Vive la Cocotte, the Autumn-Winter 1995 collection by Vivienne Westwood. This is John Galliano's Autumn-Winter 1994 show. And I chose this collection because I think it's kind of a pivotal moment in, not only in John Galliano's career, but in kind of fashion history. But with this collection, it was actually shown in a 17th century hôtel particulier in Paris on the Rue Ferrou. It was owned by the socialite São Schlumberger, who was a client of John's since he started to show in Paris. There is this idea that it's a place in kind of a slightly kind of ramshackle place, so they dressed it with leaves that they'd collected from the Bois de Boulogne and fallen chandeliers. The whole show was lit from the outside to give the idea of morning, that the morning was dawning. And Amanda Harlock once told me that the idea was that the woman was this kind of kittenish oriental princess, and she was waiting for her lover to arrive, but he'd been killed in a racing accident, and this was her kind of waking up in the morning and still being alone and walking around the empty house. And in staging the show here, what Galliano wanted to do was kind of evoke the atmosphere of old French couture houses who would stage shows on incredibly small, intimate scales. So you could really see the clothes up close, you could see how the body is moving in the clothes. And that was very different to how fashion was presented in the 90s. In terms of the clothes, the thing that I love about this show is its kind of economy. The idea of creating something really magical when you have nothing. John had already missed showing for the Autumn-Winter 1993 season. He showed Spring 1993, a collection called Olivia the Filibuster, and for Spring 94, Princess Lucretia. And having missed that season, Anna Wintour said, "You can't miss another season, you have to pull something together, you have to show something." And so this collection was pulled together both on a shoestring and, you know, kind of with absolutely no time. The vast majority of the collection is made not only in black, but out of a single fabric, which is satin back crepe. The idea being that you could actually use both sides of the fabric to make clothes look more complicated than they actually were. The kind of whole collection was based on this idea of kind of combining 1930s, 1940s glamour with kimono shapes, which is something that Galliano's been obsessed with for years. In this particular collection, it's actually a very interesting fusion of Western, Occidental tailoring technique, haute couture tailoring, very complex, very highly technical clothes, with the kind of freeness, the ease, the drapery that characterizes Asian dress. And also there's this kind of idea of sexiness. So when John talks about these kimonos, he calls them mini-monos because they're cut to kind of crotch length. I find the use of organza to make the kimonos that Michelle Hicks and Kate Moss wears interesting, because it exposes all of their kind of inner workings and it really highlights the structure. And that's something you see him doing earlier than this collection. It's something you see him doing in his work at Dior, and it's something he's been exploring recently in his work at Margiela. Specifically that use of organza to kind of provide windows onto the body, windows onto construction, a lot of the time as kind of something to sandwich something else in between. So you get the sense of kind of peering inside and seeing the sort of inner workings of something. The other thing that is interesting is these series of short shearling jackets. They're all based on the idea of wearing a jacket upside down, to the point that I own a couple of them. And when you put them on a hanger, you actually hang them upside down like a normal jacket. A lot of people see that as really connected to what Galliano did in the 1980s, which was that kind of London club kid, very experimental, very avant-garde. But here it's translated into this very kind of precise, very haute couture influenced aesthetic, but there's still that kind of, that sort of thread of rebelliousness, that thread of re-examining what clothes can mean, how clothes can be worn, you know, sort of reconfiguring elegance. The other thing that I find very interesting about this collection in terms of its influence on fashion is after grunge and after deconstruction, this is really a return to kind of refinement. It really marks a return to polish, to glamour, to grooming. All the diamonds in the show are real diamonds, loaned by different jewellery houses, and I actually got told that Lady Amanda Harlock, who was working with John at that point as a creative consultant, went to the different jewellery houses and asked to borrow jewels, but didn't tell each jewellery house that she was borrowing jewels from the others. So when all the kind of security guards turned up with all the jewels and they were mixing together kind of Van Cleef & Arpels, earrings and brooches from Harry Winston, kind of all hell broke loose. But obviously as soon as the show started, everyone thought it looked amazing and didn't mind. The magic of Galliano in the 90s was with these overt references to history, these overt references to other cultures, to vintage fashion styles, to historical costume, and then how you can actually take all of that and technically make it feel modern, make it look modern, but also make it feel modern on the body. First of all, this was an enormous commercial breakthrough for Galliano. The collection sold incredibly well. They actually weren't geared up to sell the amount that people wanted to buy from this show, because all of a sudden all the kind of craziness that Galliano had been proposing for 15 years was suddenly condensed down into something that was kind of commercial and that people could see how this was going to sell, how it was going to appeal to modern women. This was the second collection that Stephen Jones worked with John on. There was no budget to make any hats. It was really about kind of, you know, a last minute commission. What can we create? This is the idea, this is the notion, this is the woman. None of the models were paid to be in the show. They would get some clothes, and that was the way they worked with John for a number of years. You know, there wasn't a budget for hair, there wasn't a budget for makeup. And so I find something really kind of wonderful and romantic and special about the idea that it's a group of people who passionately believe in what they're doing and who passionately believe in the kind of the creative spirit and ideas of this one designer, and they come together to make it happen. The show is when everybody else kind of saw the magic in what he was creating, and not only the magic, but I think the reality to it. And certainly when you look at kind of Shalom walking in a bias cut black satin trouser suit, which is ferociously complicated to make, the idea of making a garment that should be tailored out of this kind of bias cut fabric, which is sort of molten and is really fighting against everything that tailoring is supposed to do in terms of holding a shape. Instead, this is kind of molding against the body. And certainly when you talk to people who were at this show, I don't think anyone ever kind of forgets the experience. It's, you know, it was something that was special, both in terms of a kind of a designer reaching a new level, but also in terms of the way that people looked at fashion. I really think it shifted the way people perceived fashion, not just in terms of the kind of reintroduction of this aesthetic of glamour, but also in terms of seeing it in this context, and in terms of seeing it as kind of an entire sort of creative universe, and that everything could be an engine for sort of creative expression, from the hair and makeup to the venue, to the music, to the models chosen to walk the show. There was this idea that it was all at kind of service of kind of creating a dream that then people could be part of. Now I collect pieces from because, you know, they are those souvenirs of kind of this magical thing. It is, you know, it's amazing having a piece of that and being able to see the kind of the magic that it had then and is still there, that these pieces are still wonderful, magical technically ferociously complex and kind of incredibly emotionally charged. This is Vivienne Westwood's Autumn-Winter 1995 collection. It was called by her Vive la Cocotte, which throws back to a period of French history at the end of the 17th and start of the 18th century, which Westwood was fascinated by. The inspiration for this collection was a French courtesan called Ninon de Lenclos, who was not only known for her kind of beauty and seductiveness, but also for her fierce intelligence. And an invite to her salon in the late 17th century was the kind of height of social aspirations for men or women. But what Westwood really kind of thumped at this point was the idea that the 20th century was tied up with the idea of progress, and that somehow everything was going to get better and be better in the future, and therefore that the past was of no interest. And as a kind of counteraction to that, Westwood looked back to history. She took inspiration from the styles, but also from the cuts and the kind of aesthetic obsessions of the past, not only through fashion, but through fine art and culture as well. Also, the silhouette is intended to be an echo of, not of that period aesthetically, but of that period's mindset. Every outfit in this collection is built on a foundation garment. The bum pad has been exaggerated into a cage bustle, which is attached to a high-waisted girdle, and the cage that it's actually made, that actually forms that, was made by the father of Vivienne's husband, Andreas Kronthaler, and as well as this kind of pad extending the posterior, there's also a padded corset. The whole idea of this collection was that you could wear the garments without this foundation, that the garments could be shaped without it, and you would be left with kind of interesting hollowness around these sort of exaggerated forms. But in Westwood's eyes, she adored it when people wore it with the foundation, when they had these kind of extreme exaggerated silhouettes. And for all its historical echoes, Westwood herself said that she loved this collection because she ended up with a silhouette that had never been done before. In a sense, that also goes against the kind of pervading orthodoxy of the late 20th century, which was the kind of rise of sportswear, this kind of rise of tracksuit culture, and this idea that comfort is about being kind of physically uninhibited, whereas Vivienne's clothes are about the comfort to be found in confidence, the comfort to be found in the power of an image that you can project. Vive la Cocotte was split into multiple different sections. It's the way that Vivienne works when she's designing. She thinks about a story and she thinks about costuming the characters within that story. This sequence, which is called All Girls Together, and which Vivienne said was a reference to the fact that when women wore trousers through history, it was frequently connected to lesbianism. So obviously this is kind of a provocative parade of women together with all of those kind of sexual, bisexual undertones. Because for Vivienne, there always has to be not only an aesthetic justification, but a narrative reasoning behind every kind of decision that she makes in terms of the way that the garments look, the way they're constructed, the way that they feel. Here, when other designers are looking at kind of unstructured slip dresses, proposing kind of minimalist silhouettes, when people like Miuccia Prada are using nylon as kind of a modern luxury fabric as opposed to a utilitarian work fabric, Vivienne dives into history and proposes these silhouettes that are kind of arcane, extreme, incredibly eroticized, which is also interesting because this was a period when a lot of people were pulling away from kind of overtly sexualized images. And by contrast, what Vivienne is proposing here is something that is, on the one hand, incredibly eroticized, but also a little bit neutered, because these women are so exaggerated, they're so unreal. Vivienne herself said, you know, she loved this show because the women ended up looking like fashion illustrations rather than human beings. But when you push it to that point,
there's also this idea that there is kind of the sexuality is neutered. However kind of extreme and arcane this collection looks, it did have a much wider influence on fashion than we would initially give it credit for. When you look at the work of John Galliano and Alexander McQueen, for instance, the incredible interest that they have in construction was triggered in a large part by Vivienne's exploration of these kind of styles. And certainly if you look at work that John Galliano did at Dior, even a decade later, you can see the influence of these kind of silhouettes. This incredibly heightened, incredibly constructed, incredibly artificial vision of a woman. It isn't about a single era. It's not about kind of reviving one point of view, although there is an interest in the 17th and 18th century. There's also an interest in the 19th century. There are echoes of 19th century garments, 19th century shapes. It's really about this kind of historical fusion that Vivienne argued with a lot of her designs at this period, fusions that could only have been put together in the present. And that went down to fabrication, it went down to the combinations of these different kind of cultural influences, really kind of telescoping all of these different historical themes and combining them into a kind of a collage or a bricolage that says something about where we were at that particular point in time. In looking at kind of late 20th century clothing and looking particularly at this period in the 1990s, I find it really interesting that there's this kind of confusion over what a woman should be, over what kind of, over where we are in the world. And I think that's also tied in with the idea of coming to the end of an era. You can see a similar sort of uncertainty at the end of the 19th century. You can certainly see it at the end of the 18th century, the most kind of potent example of that being the French Revolution. And you see all of these kind of societal values, you know, ideas of class, of gender, of social status being upended. You saw that at the end of the 18th century, and you kind of saw it again at the end of the 20th. Certainly fashion, I think, was an incredibly interesting arena because that sort of discomfort and that uncertainty about exactly what was going to happen. Vivienne had an enormous admiration for the work of Christian Dior. And when Dior launched his new look in 1947, he didn't label it as the new look, and he saw it as incredibly retrograde. He saw it as very nostalgic, very historical. And it was about kind of discovering things that he felt had been lost and that shouldn't have been lost. The thing that is amazing about looking at Westwood's work throughout her career, but for me particularly at this point in time, is this kind of invention, is this constant exploration, this kind of provocation. You know, why can't an evening dress be knitted, or conversely, why can't an evening dress you know, be beaded to look like a naked body? There are all these kind of challenges to the way that things are done, while also this incredible respect for the past. But I think at the same time, by looking at things with an unconventional viewpoint, you're able to kind of combine things in unexpected ways. You're able to look at decorative details and twist them around. And certainly that's what Westwood did. You know, elements of her clothes always have some kind of connection to the past, but they're used in such kind of unimaginable ways. They're used in such manners that could never have been conceived in the past. This is another example worn by Kate Moss, which is an 18th century men's garment, which has been reconfigured for women. And inside that jacket is a corset to kind of really exaggerate the kind of feminine shape. There's also something very interesting in that it echoes back to 18th century riding habits, which were the only garments by law for women that could be made by men. It was riding habits and corsets, and here they're combined together. But again, here there are multiple references to history. It isn't just the 18th century. You know, there are in this single outfit, there are references to the 19th century, the 18th, the 17th. It's really about combining all of these different historical styles and trying to come up with something that kind of speaks about the present.
This collection is Lacroix's first own label collection. It's his first own label haute couture, and it was presented in July 1987 with kind of frenzied anticipation from both the press and the clients. You can kind of see here some of the sort of historical references, the references to those couture shapes of the past, specifically to Schiaparelli, who Lacroix always professed enormous admiration for. And also references to all. Really, this entire collection was about Lacroix. It was very purely about Lacroix. He wasn't, as with Patou, trying to kind of tie anything to an existing legacy or revive an existing legacy. All eyes were on him, and it was very much about his proposal of what he wanted to kind of show clients and what he wanted his identity to be. And as these kind of outfits come out, you will see that it's very much, his aesthetic was very much about combining the kind of the ostentation, the excess, the sort of frivolity of the 1980s with styles that reference specific cultures and with styles that reference specific historical periods. You can kind of see here the sort of exaggeration, the exuberance of Lacroix's style, which was very close to illustration. Lacroix himself didn't have an enormous degree of technical knowledge. He wasn't trained in haute couture, and he said that it was important that he had an incredibly technically proficient staff who were able to construct his clothes exactly the way he drew them. The thing I find really fascinating about this collection is, first of all, that it is the very kind of apotheosis of Lacroix's style for me. But with the backing of Financieri Agache, who at this point also owned Christian Dior, they weren't yet owners of Louis Vuitton, which is when the name changes to the LVMH group. Lacroix was able to kind of indulge his sort of passion for lavish use of material, intricate construction, extravagant embroideries, and in this collection, for instance, he collaborated heavily with the House of Lesage to embroider different pieces, and really being shown at this point, just a few months before Black Monday and the stock market crash of 1987, it's kind of the sort of the pinnacle of that 1980s, that exuberant, extravagant 1980s style, which really after 1987 was never the same. The other thing I find really interesting about Lacroix is, you know, despite all the buzz around his name, despite his popularity, despite his influence on fashion as a whole, he never actually made any money. The House of Lacroix closed in 2009, and it had made a loss for its entire history. But when you look at these clothes, they are kind of extraordinary. There's something amazing about the fact that these clothes were ever produced, and also something amazing about the fact that these weren't a sort of designer's kind of indulgence. They weren't a total designer's fantasy. These were clothes that were then sold. They were clothes that were kind of passionately seized upon by women, and young women, old women, really women across the board. They massively influenced fashion, and the house itself at an haute couture level was very successful. Of course, despite the high prices, the things that not many people know about haute couture and that I don't feel is often communicated is the fact that haute couture makes no money. The maximum production of an haute couture style by the rules of the Chambre syndicale will be 6. Haute couture clothes are made to measure. They are predominantly sewn by hand, and the kind of labour intensity of the garments means that you're not actually able to charge the same kind of markup that you can with ready-to-wear clothes, because the clothes would be astronomically expensive. Even though haute couture clothes are incredibly expensive, the profit you make on them is something like 1%. In October 1987, Lacroix went to New York to present his couture collection. I think it was 2 weeks after Black Monday, and kind of irony of ironies, he showed this haute couture collection in the World Financial Center in the kind of aftermath of one of the biggest financial crashes of the century. There is a wonderful piece in New York Magazine that was written about this, And when Lacroix was interviewed, it said that the two questions he was asked most often are, how do you sit in a bustle, and who in the world is going to buy these clothes? And I find something really fascinating about this show because of that, because it is kind of emblematic of this way of life, this way of dressing, and this style that is about to evaporate. That New York Magazine article was headlined on the cover with the title "Dancing on the Lip of the Volcano," which I think is a really amazing idea, and it's something I think about every single time I look at this show and see these kind of women sashaying out in these sort of cod historical costumes down kind of a lava red catwalk. I think that the thing that I'm really fascinated by is placing Lacroix in a wider cultural context. I think if you think about postmodernism, you have to think of Lacroix as the kind of quintessential postmodernist couturier, because what his references are these images of the past. He comes from that museological background, that curatorial background, and a lot of the time he's referencing things from paintings. He's referencing 19th century work, 18th century work. You can see in this dress worn by Marie Sesneck. It's obviously an allusion to kind of the sort of 1780s French court costume, which again is ironic given the fact that the guillotine was about to fall on this kind of luxury. But what Lacroix did was treat all of those references with, ironically considering his training, with absolute irreverence. It was about kind of telescoping these different costume sources, about combining them. So here you see a black velvet and taffeta dress, which is very much in the style of kind of Dior in the 1940s. It's shortened above the knee in the style of the miniskirts of the 1960s. It's combined with a hat, which could have been taken from the kind of Napoleon. It's really about combining all of these things and in a sense making a sort of nonsense of chronology, of geography. There's all these different cultural references combining together. These clothes coming out now are obviously the evening looks, and you know, it is, when you look at it now, it does seem kind of quintessentially 80s, but that's very much because Lacroix style is what determined that period. It's really the thing that shaped taste at this point, where, you know, nothing was ever too much. There's a wonderful story in I believe Nicholas Coleridge's book, The Fashion Conspiracy, that he was sat beside Paloma Picasso at this show, and Paloma Picasso was saying to her husband, "Oh, that one I love, that dress I would love to own," and he was saying, "You must own, you have to have it." Incidentally, this quilted skirt is based on a caparison, which is a quilted blanket that they put over horses when they are fighting in the bull ring. So there are all these references because of Lacroix's upbringing to Spanish bullfighting, to Spanish culture, to flamenco, you know, and also quite sort of idiosyncratic, quite humorous touches. There's always a lot of kind of wit to what Lacroix does. It's never quite as sort of straight-laced as, for instance, Yves Saint Laurent, who at this point was also proposing clothes that were at least as decorated and extravagant and luxurious as Lacroix. That said, the main idea of capitalizing on Lacroix was through more competitively priced ready-to-wear, and also through perfume. And Lacroix launched a perfume called C'est la Vie in 1992, which was a commercial disaster. And the ready-to-wear line, for some reason, never took off in the way that everyone felt that it should have. And also looking at those ready-to-wear collections, they never quite have the sort of magic of the couture, which Lacroix continued to have through the 90s and right up until he closed. He had a incredibly loyal cadre of clients. Apparently, a client offered to write a check to underwrite the Lacroix business and ensure that the couture house could continue. That was how much these women loved and adored wearing these clothes, because really you couldn't get clothes quite like this. I mean, this is a very extreme example. This skirt was called a Belarus skirt or a road sweeping skirt. And it's executed in ruched salmon taffeta with velvet and with detachable sleeves, which were a very big, very strange, very archaic thing, kind of Lacroix-ism. This idea of kind of sort of extravagant sleeves of all different sort of constructions and proportions. And I think you can see Lacroix's sort of passion for the past, but also the idea that he did understand, in a similar way to Karl Lagerfeld, that you can't have too much respect for it. You have to have a certain irreverence. You have to have a certain disrespect to be able to rip something apart and create something new. This is the wedding dress, a meringue of ivory, silk taffeta, with a jacket embroidered with a heart from the Camaragu where Lacroix grew up. And again, really, the heart was embroidered by Lesage. And this is, a very traditional end to an haute couture show, the idea of closing with a bride. And again, that's almost kind of it's a harking back to tradition, it's a harking back to history, something really that Lacroix was challenging, reinventing. It's also something I think he wasn't trying to kind of rip down these couture institutions. Really what Lacroix was about, the importance of Lacroix as a new couture house launching, was the idea that it was this new approach to couture, this idea of allowing this art form to continue at a point when everyone assumed it was going to be dying. And that's, that's one of the many reasons that I love this show, is for its, how much Lacroix absolutely adores couture, how much he adores the history of the kind of the art form, but also how much he's able to reinvent it, how much he's able to challenge it, and as well the fact that this is, representative of a way of fashion that really is now kind of extinct.